The first thing Abigail Hayes heard was her father laughing. Not kind laughter, not warm laughter. The kind that came from a bottle, from rot, from a man who had sold every decent piece of himself and still needed more. It crashed through the tiny South Boston apartment while freezing rain battered the cracked window and dirty water crept under the frame. "Don't bother talking to her," Richard Hayes slurred, gripping Abigail hard enough to bruise as he shoved her toward the stranger in their living room. Deaf. His whiskey-soaked breath hit her face. His fingers dug into her shoulder. The peeling floral wallpaper behind him looked damp and sick under the weak ceiling light. The apartment smelled like gin, mold, stale smoke, and fear. Abigail kept her eyes lowered to the scuffed floorboards. She let her body go slack. She wore the same empty face she had worn for 10 years. The broken girl. The silent girl. The girl who heard nothing, said nothing, reacted to nothing. The girl men stopped seeing. It had kept her alive this long. But the man standing across the room was not like the drunks, gang runners, and debt collectors who usually came through their door. He was too still, too elegant, too large. His shadow seemed to swallow half the room. His charcoal coat looked made for palaces, not apartments with stained carpets and broken heating. His pale face held no disgust, no impatience, no anger. That was worse. It meant he did not have to perform power. He simply was power. Then he leaned down. His mouth barely moved. Yet a voice slid straight into her head like cold silk in the dark. "I know you can hear me, little bird." Abigail's pulse slammed once so hard it hurt. "And I know exactly why you are trembling." She did not move, did not blink, did not breathe too sharply, but inside something ancient and terrified tore awake. "There is a specific kind of silence that comes with survival," the voice murmured in her skull. "I know it well." For one awful second she thought she might faint, not because he knew, because he understood. At 8 years old, Abigail had learned that sound could ruin a life in less than a second. A gunshot, a scream, tires spitting water on 4th Street outside O'Connor's pub, her mother's body dropping before Abigail even understood what blood really was. After that night, the world never felt safe again. Men shouted, glasses smashed, cops barked questions, doctors spoke in careful tones, and her father wept for about 3 days before turning grief into liquor and rage. When a doctor said the trauma might have rendered her profoundly deaf and selectively mute, Abigail did not correct him. She remembered that moment for the rest of her life. A door had opened. People pitied deaf girls. They ignored deaf girls. They said cruel things right in front of deaf girls. They stopped expecting answers. They stopped asking questions. In a city where men lied, hit, grabbed, bought, sold, and forgot, invisible was safer than loved. So Abigail learned the role. She learned not to flinch at slammed doors. She learned not to turn when someone shouted her name. She learned how to watch mouths and read every tiny move of lips. She learned to use sign language just enough to seem real. She learned how to tuck her soul into the deepest corner of herself and lock it there. Richard Hayes, her father, made sure she never regretted that choice. He was made of cheap gin, bad cards, sweat, excuses, and anger that exploded over nothing. He ran errands for men who ran numbers through the old seaport warehouses. He borrowed money he could never repay. He blamed the dead, the weather, bad luck, Irish blood, America, and God, never himself. When he lost, he threw bottles. When he won, he drank more. When he looked at Abigail, he did not see a daughter. He saw the broken thing life had left behind in his home. If she had ever broken character, if she had ever reacted too quickly to one of his screams, one of his bottles, one of his drunken rages, he would have known she had chosen silence. And a man like Richard Hayes could forgive weakness before he could forgive being made a fool. So on that late November Tuesday, while heavy footsteps climbed the stairs in perfect rhythm, Abigail sat at the kitchen table pretending to mend the tear in her only winter coat. Her needle moved through cheap wool. Her fingers stayed steady, but every footstep on the wooden stairwell vibrated through the floor and into her bones. These were not drunk men, not her father's usual wrecks. These steps were precise, controlled, predatory, the kind of footsteps that already knew how the night would end. The door did not open. It exploded inward, wood cracked, hinges screamed, rain-laced cold rushed through the room. Richard lurched awake from the recliner with a pathetic gasp. "Please," he babbled before he even saw who had entered. Please, I have the money, I just need till Friday." Abigail dropped her sewing and backed into the wall, wide-eyed, playing frightened confusion. 3 men came in, but only one mattered. He filled the doorway like a verdict. 6'6", maybe more. Black hair. Skin so pale it looked carved from moonlight. Eyes gray at first glance, then wrong at the edges as though crimson fire waited beneath the surface. Dominic Sterling. Even in neighborhoods where people pretended not to believe in monsters, everyone knew the Sterling name. Shipping, clubs, judges, police captains, unions, favors, disappearances. The kind of wealth that bent laws, the kind of power that buried scandals. And beneath that, deeper and darker, the old whispers. That the Sterlings did not age like men. That they owned the night because they belonged to it. That if one of them looked at you too long, you did not remain entirely your own. Dominic did not look at the wrecked apartment. He did not look at Richard groveling on the carpet. He looked straight at Abigail as if he had crossed the city for her alone. "Richard," he said, and even allowed his voice seemed to vibrate inside her chest. Low-polished, merciless. "You owe the Sterling estate $400,000. Your grace period expired at midnight." Richard scrambled backwards, nearly slipping on his own spilled bottle. "I had a bad run. The game was rigged. Mr. Sterling, please just give me a week. I'll rob a bank. I'll do anything." Dominic took one slow step forward. Frost seemed to move through the room with him. Abigail saw her own breath. "I have no use for your petty theft," Dominic said. He never raised his voice. He did not have to. Then his gaze returned to her. That gaze did something terrible. It did not strip her. It assessed her, studied her, claimed understanding before permission. "But I am willing to clear your ledger tonight entirely." Richard's face changed so fast it made her sick. Hope lit it from within. Not fatherly horror, not shame, hope. "Anything," he whispered. "Name it, sir." Dominic lifted one elegant hand and pointed straight at Abigail. "I want her." The words cut through the room cleaner than a knife. Everything inside Abigail went cold. Richard blinked, stunned for the wrong reason. Her. He actually sounded confused, as if he had forgotten she was even there. "But sir, she's broken, she ain't right, hasn't spoken a word since she was a kid." He grabbed her shoulder again and shoved her forward hard enough to make her stumble. "Don't bother talking to her, she's deaf. Useless to a man like you. You want a maid, she can barely follow." Dominic moved. 1 second he was a step away. The next he was right in front of her. The scent of winter cedar, expensive cologne, and something metallic and sweet wrapped around her. Blood, old blood, ancient blood. He lifted one freezing hand and brushed his knuckles against her cheek. Her skin almost burned from the cold. She kept her eyes dull, fixed somewhere near his collar. Then that voice slid into her mind again, smoother now, more intimate, more dangerous. "Your pulse gives you away. Perfectly steady until I threaten to take you." Then there it was, a beautiful spike of comprehension. Abigail bit the inside of her mouth until she tasted copper. "How long have you lived inside this dark little theater, Abigail?" Her name inside his voice felt like a trap closing. She signed toward her father with trembling hands, keeping the performance alive. "Who is he? What does he want?" Dominic watched her fingers. Something dark flickered behind his eyes. Perhaps amusement, perhaps admiration, perhaps hunger. Then he turned to Richard. "The debt is forgiven." One of Dominic's guards pulled out a ledger. Another lit a silver lighter. The pages burned on the floor between them. Richard stared at the fire like it was salvation. He did not fight. He did not beg for her. He did not even look at her for long. Whatever small dying thread of love Abigail had still tied to the word *father snapped cleanly in that moment. Burned with the paper, Dominic extended his hand to her. "Bring nothing. Everything you need will be provided." Abigail stayed still, forcing him to face her silence. The smile that touched his mouth was tiny, terrifying. Then, without effort, he bent and lifted her into his arms. She thrashed on instinct and on purpose. It had to look real. She signed wildly over his shoulder, "Help me, Dad, help me." Richard reached for the bottle on the table and poured himself another drink with shaking hands. "Be a good girl, Abby," he muttered without turning around. That was all. That was the price of her life. $400,000 and a glass of gin. Dominic carried her through the apartment, down the rotting stairwell, and out into the freezing rain. She could feel every hard line of him through his coat. He was solid as carved stone, cold as midnight. Outside, a sleek black Maybach waited at the curb with its engine running. City lights slid over the wet street. Rain soaked her hair. She pressed her face into his coat and closed her eyes. "You can drop the act now," his voice murmured in her mind as he placed her inside the car. "We are going to be spending a very long time together." She gave him nothing, not a thought, not a word. Not a flinch he could use, only silence, the one weapon she had left. The drive out of Boston felt endless. She sat as far from him as the leather seat allowed, staring at her own faint reflection in the tinted glass. Dominic did not speak aloud, but the pressure of his presence never eased. Sometimes his thoughts brushed the edge of hers like fingertips on a locked door. "Your blood smells wrong for human. Wild flowers, rain, old magic. What are you, little bird?" She looked out at the road and thought of nothing she could help. Her mother's face came and went like a blurred photograph. Her mother in the bakery apron. Her mother smiling softly over potted herbs on the windowsill. Her mother dead in the street. Abigail did not know what she was. She had only ever known what pretending had made her. By the time the city lights vanished behind them, the road had become a black ribbon through dark forest. Then the gates appeared, tall iron, cruelly beautiful. Beyond them rose the Sterling estate, a vast Gothic manor of black stone and ironwork hidden among hills and trees like something the night itself had built. It was too large to be called a house, too watchful to be called a home. When the car stopped, the front doors opened before anyone knocked. Pale servants stood in two silent lines, perfect posture, empty eyes, thralls, Abigail thought at once. Humans who had traded something vital for the favor of monsters. Dominic stepped out, then held the door for her as though escorting royalty instead of property. Rain glittered on the stone steps. She climbed them on numb legs and crossed into the grand foyer. Everything inside the manor was wealth and control. Marble floors, a chandelier spilling light like frozen fire, a staircase sweeping upward in a curve too grand for ordinary lives. At the foot of it stood another vampire. He had Dominic's stillness, Dominic's elegance, Dominic's chill beauty, but his eyes were green and calculating rather than storm gray, and something sly lived at the edge of his mouth. "My king," he said with a slight bow, "you have returned, and you brought her, a pet." Dominic's whole body changed, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to freeze the room. "She is not a pet, Gregory." Gregory's gaze flicked over Abigail with clear contempt. "She looks half dead with fear. Does she even speak English?" Dominic did not look away from Abigail. "She does not speak at all. She is deaf and mute. Have Beatrice prepare the East Wing suite for her." Then his voice cooled further. "And Gregory, if anyone in this house harms a single hair on her head, I will pull their spine through their throat. Do you understand?" Gregory straightened at once. "Perfectly, my king." Abigail kept her face blank, but inside her thoughts crashed into each other. "My king." The rumors were true. She had not been bought by a rich criminal. She had been bought by the ruler of something much older and more terrible than the human underworld. The apex predator of the eastern seaboard had carried her out of South Boston like stolen treasure. The weeks that followed were a nightmare made of silk. Her room in the East Wing was larger than the apartment where she had lived her whole life. A four-poster bed, a carved wardrobe filled with clothes in her exact size, a bath big enough to drown in, windows overlooking frozen gardens. Every luxury felt like another kind of lock. An older housekeeper named Beatrice brought her meals on silver trays and looked at her with gentle pity that seemed almost human. Abigail did not trust it. She trusted nothing here, least of all Dominic Sterling, who came every evening as regular as dusk. He sat in the chair by the fireplace with a crystal glass of dark red liquid in his hand and watched her, sometimes for an hour, sometimes more. He would ask silent questions into her mind. "How old were you when you learned not to cry? Did your father hit you before or after the doctors named your silence? What would you do if I ordered you to speak?" Other nights he tested her. A book falling behind her, a sudden movement, a threat murmured close enough to raise the hairs on her neck. He hunted for a reaction the way other men might hunt for a confession. Abigail gave him nothing. She turned pages. She sipped tea. She stared through him. She moved through the house in a perfect bubble of false quiet, and because everyone believed the act, they stopped censoring themselves around her. That was when the manor became less a prison and more an open throat. The vampires treated her like furniture, decorative, breathing, harmless. That made her dangerous. She wandered the library, the winter gardens, the long corridors between drawing rooms. She kept her eyes soft and empty while her ears took in everything. Who hated whom? Which coven was restless? Which guard gossiped? Which servant feared Gregory? She learned that Dominic ruled with absolute control and even deeper isolation. She learned the court respected him, feared him, obeyed him, and still looked for weakness. Most of all, she learned that Gregory smiled too often when Dominic was not in the room. Then, one cold afternoon, almost a month after her arrival, Abigail sat curled in a library window seat with a book open in her lap and her eyes nearly closed, pretending to nap in a shaft of weak winter light. The heavy doors clicked shut. Two men entered. Gregory was one of them. "He's distracted," Gregory hissed. "Ever since he brought that human stray into the house, he's neglected the southern patrol." Another man, voice rough and unfamiliar, answered, "Are you certain the poison will work? He is ancient." Gregory gave a low laugh that turned Abigail's blood to ice. "Concentrated dead blood laced with silver nitrate. I've been dousing his private reserve for a week, just enough to weaken him without alerting his palate. Tonight, at the solstice banquet, I give the final dose. Once the king falls, the council will choose the strongest hand. Mine." Abigail's heart crashed once, twice, too hard. She forced her breathing slow. "Even dead?" the other man asked. "And the girl?" Gregory's answer came without hesitation. "I'll drain her dry myself as a celebration." Their footsteps faded. The doors shut again. Abigail sat perfectly still with a book in her lap and a war in her chest. The silence that had saved her all these years had just become a death sentence. If she stayed quiet, Dominic would die and Gregory would kill her after. If she warned Dominic, she exposed the lie that had kept her alive since childhood. And what did a vampire king do to a human who had deceived him for weeks under his own roof? That question followed her all the way out of the library. But another followed harder. What happened to a girl who stayed silent while the only person who had ever truly seen her walked straight into betrayal? By the time she reached the West Wing, she already knew. Tonight, for the first time in 10 years, Abigail Hayes was going to speak. The West Wing felt colder than the rest of the manor, not merely in temperature but in meaning. This was the king's territory, the part of the house where authority thickened the air and every corridor felt watched. Abigail moved down the dim passage barefoot, the Persian runner soft beneath her steps, her pulse loud enough to make her sick. She had spent 10 years mastering stillness, but stillness was not the same as courage. Her hands were shaking. Her throat already hurt, as if her body knew what she was about to force it to do. Outside the heavy mahogany doors of Dominic's study stood Silas, a broad-shouldered guard with a scar splitting one eyebrow and cruelty carved into the shape of his mouth. He looked at Abigail and sneered in open contempt. Because she was deaf, he made no effort to hide it. He stepped into her path and said something mocking, low and ugly, probably expecting her to shrink. She did not stop. She kept her empty expression and kept walking. For one tense second he had to choose whether to lay hands on the king's protected guest or move. Dominic's threat on Abigail's first night had clearly been heard. Silas's jaw clenched, but he stepped aside and shoved the door open with a violent little gesture of disgust. Abigail entered the study and closed the door behind her. The latch clicked. It sounded like a point of no return. The room was vast and dark and beautiful in a way that made her think of ancient churches and graveyards after rain. Bookcases rose to the vaulted ceiling. Blue fire burned in the hearth, unnatural and still. A huge desk sat at the far end like a throne carved into the shape of a workspace. Dominic was behind it, one hand pressed to his temple, eyes shut. For the first time since that ruined apartment, he did not look untouchable. His skin held an ashen cast. His shoulders trembled once, almost invisibly. Gregory's poison was already inside him, eating through immortal strength from the blood outward. Then Dominic's eyes snapped open, gray ringed with crimson, dangerous even in weakness. In one instant the trace of vulnerability vanished. Authority covered him like armor. "I did not summon you, Abigail." His telepathic voice cut through her like sharpened ice. Return to your quarters, now. She stayed where she was. He stared harder. Are you so broken you cannot understand a simple command? Leave. Her throat tightened. 10 years of silence rose in her like a wall. She had not used her voice for speech since she was 8, not in private, not alone, not once. Words felt impossible now. Alien, like trying to move a limb long turned to stone. But the choice had already been made in the library. She opened her mouth. Nothing came at first but a dry scrape of air. Dominic leaned forward, confusion flashing through the steel of his expression. Abigail swallowed hard and forced sound through pain. The single syllable broke like rusted metal. Her own voice terrified her. It was hoarse, weak, cracked by disuse and memory. Tears sprang to her eyes from the sheer physical shock of it. Dominic went utterly still. Even the fire seemed to dim. She dragged in another breath that cut her throat on the way down. He's going to kill you. She did not see him move. One moment he was across the room. The next her back hit the door and Dominic's freezing hand closed around her throat. Not crushing, not gentle, exact. His face was inches from hers, beautiful and terrible and wild with revelation. You spoke, he whispered aloud, and the sound of his real voice hit her like a storm. She grabbed at his wrist more from instinct than strategy. I can hear, she choked out. I can speak. His eyes narrowed to slits. For 10 years. The words were soft enough to be frightening. Your father said 10 years, you walked my halls, sat in my library, let me search you, lied to me with every breath. His grip tightened just enough to remind her how easy death would be in his hands. You are a spectacularly dangerous liar, Abigail Hayes. Why? Tears spilled before she could stop them, half pain, half fury. To survive. Her voice cracked but did not vanish. If they think you're broken, they leave you alone. If they leave you alone, you live. My father, the gangs, the noise, the men, I could not stop because it worked. It kept me alive. Dominic searched her face as if looking for the exact point where truth began. Slowly, the murderous edge in his expression changed. Not to softness, never softness, to something darker, respect sharpened by fascination. He released enough pressure for her to breathe fully, though he did not step away. And yet, he murmured, brushing one cold thumb beneath the tears on her cheek, you broke a decade of perfect silence to warn the monster who bought you. She swallowed against the ache in her throat. Gregory, she rasped. He's been poisoning your private blood reserve. Silver nitrate and dead blood. He said tonight at the solstice banquet he'll give you the last dose in your ceremonial chalice. He plans to kill you publicly, blame the Southern Coven, take the throne, then kill me. Dominic stepped back. His gaze dropped once to his own trembling hand. When he looked up again, the king had returned in full. A coward's poison, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Silver nitrate burns immortal cells from the inside. Microdoses would mask the taste until weakness became visible. His jaw tightened. The air in the room seemed to thicken with rage so controlled it became almost elegant. Gregory is not acting alone, Abigail nodded. Silas is with him. I heard enough to know there are others. Dominic turned and crossed to a hidden panel in the wall. With a precise motion, he opened it. Behind it hung weapons that looked old enough to have killed kings before England was a country. Silver blades, black firearms, dark steel that seemed to drink the firelight. He strapped a narrow dagger beneath his sleeve and checked the balance of another in his palm. Abigail watched, throat burning, heart pounding. What do we do? She asked. Dominic looked at her then, really looked at her, as if the lie had been burned away and something far more interesting stood in its place. A terrible smile touched his mouth. Exactly what they expect, he said. We attend the banquet, you remain deaf, remain mute, remain underestimated. You will be my eyes and ears among those fools. He stepped close enough for her to feel the cold of him again. When the moment comes, stay behind me. And if I do, she asked before she could stop herself. For one sharp second, something almost amused flickered in his face. Then you had better learn quickly how to survive a room full of enraged vampires. He lifted a hand and traced 2 fingers lightly over the bruises forming on her throat where he had pinned her. You should have told me sooner. The words came out rougher than she expected. Dominic's eyes darkened. No, he said. You should never have had to live in a world where silence was safer than speech. It was the first kind thing anyone had said to her in so long that she nearly forgot how to stand. The grand hall that night looked like a dream built by monsters. Black candles dripped from crystal chandeliers. Long mahogany tables gleamed beneath silver platters and crystal decanters filled with blood dark enough to pass for wine at a glance. Music floated through the room from a hidden quartet. Velvet, jewels, diamonds, silk, pale faces, sharp smiles. The court of the Sterling King. Beatrice had dressed Abigail in a midnight blue gown that made her feel too visible, too womanly, too breakable. Around her neck Dominic fastened an antique sapphire choker, heavy and cold against her bruised skin. His fingers lingered at the clasp. "It marks you as mine," he told her in a tone so calm it felt more dangerous than a threat. "No one will touch you while you wear it, but you must not speak. If they know what you are, they will kill you before I can stop them." She looked up at him then. "What am I?" The question came out smaller than she wanted. Dominic's gaze held hers for one suspended beat. "Alive," he said. "For now, that is enough." Then the doors opened and the hall swallowed them. The noise died the instant Dominic entered. Hundreds of vampires bowed, some gracefully, some stiffly, some with loyalty, some with calculation. Abigail followed 2 steps behind him, eyes wide and seemingly uncomprehending, though her mind was working at a fever pitch. She saw Gregory by the head table in a burgundy suit, smiling like a saint painted over rot. She saw Lady Vivian Croft from the Manhattan Coven studying Abigail's necklace with envy and contempt. She saw Alastair Reed of the Southern Coven standing tense and alert near the far side of the hall, his posture too careful for a man supposedly welcomed among friends. Dominic took his place at the head table. A low velvet cushion waited by his right side, the position of a favored thrall or cherished pet. Abigail's humiliation burned hot but useful. From there she could see everything. She lowered herself onto it with perfect silent obedience and let the court think what it wanted. Course after course passed before her. Meat, fruits, strange sauces, richer food than she had ever eaten in Boston. Dominic touched none of it. He drank only water. He let a faint weakness show in his posture, just enough to tempt treachery closer. Gregory watched him with hungry patience. Abigail forced herself to breathe evenly and read the room. Lips moved behind fans, behind crystal glasses, behind half-smiles. "The king looks pale. Tonight, be ready. When the signal comes." Her stomach twisted tighter with every passing minute. There were more traitors than she had feared. Too many swords in too many shadows. Midnight approached. The great clock at the end of the hall began to chime. The music died. Gregory rose smoothly and lifted his hands as if about to bless the gathering. "My lords and ladies," he announced, his voice rich with false loyalty, "on the longest night of the year, we honor the strength, power, and eternal reign of our king." A thrall approached carrying a silver tray. On it sat Dominic's ceremonial chalice, heavy dark metal set with raw rubies. Even from where she sat, Abigail caught the sharp chemical sting cutting through the sweet metallic scent of blood. Silver nitrate, stronger now, lethal. Gregory lifted the goblet and turned to Dominic with a reverent smile that did not reach his eyes. "To our king, may his reign be as eternal as the night." The hall echoed, "To the king." Dominic rose slowly, every movement a masterpiece of controlled weakness. He took the chalice into his hand. "When I give the word," his voice slid into Abigail's mind, colder than the winter outside. Asterisk dropped beneath the table. "Do not hesitate." Gregory's gaze glittered. Silas's hand moved toward his sword. Time narrowed to the chalice between them. Dominic looked down into it for one long moment, then lifted his eyes to Gregory. "A beautiful toast," he said softly. "But a king does not drink alone on solstice. He shares his power with his most loyal subject." Gregory's smile faltered. Dominic held out the poisoned chalice. His eyes flared crimson. "Drink with me, Gregory." The room stopped breathing. Gregory stared at the goblet as if it had grown teeth. "My king," he said carefully, "it would be improper. Tradition." Dominic's voice dropped and the chandeliers shook. "I am the tradition. Drink." The color drained from Gregory's face. He took one half-step back. His eyes darted toward Silas, toward the other planted guards, toward escape. Then the mask shattered. "He knows," Gregory screamed. But he did not lunge at Dominic, he lunged at Abigail. The most vulnerable point in the room, the soft throat beside the throne. "Now, little bird," Dominic roared in her mind. Abigail threw herself backwards just as Gregory's silver blade cut the air where her neck had been. She hit the floor and rolled under the banquet table as the grand hall exploded into chaos. The world beneath the table became darkness, velvet, splintered wood, and screaming. Above her, immortal civility tore open and the beasts underneath came out. Glass shattered. Silver rang against silver. Roars vibrated through the floor. Abigail crawled on ripped silk and broken crystal, fighting the urge to cover her ears like a child. She had spent years pretending not to hear gunshots and shouting in South Boston, but this was different. This was not human rage. This was predatory war. "Stay low," Dominic commanded through the storm in her mind. "Do not go to the doors." His voice was terrifyingly steady, not the voice of a dying king, the voice of an apex predator unleashed. Abigail peered through a gap in the tablecloth. Silas launched across the table, sword raised for Dominic's heart. Dominic caught him by the throat in midair with one hand. One hand. He held the huge guard suspended as if weight meant nothing. "You chose poorly, Silas," Dominic said aloud, calm as winter. Then he snapped his neck. The crack cut through the hall like a gunshot. He threw the body aside. For one stunned second, every traitor in the room hesitated. That hesitation killed them. Alastair Reed, realizing the trap had been set to frame the Southern Coven, drew twin daggers and bellowed, "Treason! The Sterling King stands! Slay the usurpers!" The hall divided into battle lines. Ash filled the air as silver found hearts. Vampires moved too fast for human sight, blurring between candlelight and blood. Abigail watched boots, shadows, positions. "Three to your left," she thought with every ounce of focus she had, not knowing whether the link between them truly worked. "I see them," came Dominic's immediate reply. She nearly gasped. Their minds touched like drawn blades. He pivoted and drove the poisoned chalice into one attacker's face, then tore a sword from another and cut through two more in one savage motion. He was magnificent, horrible, unstoppable, and Gregory was gone. Abigail searched frantically beneath the chaos until a pair of burgundy shoes stopped inches from her face. The tablecloth was ripped upward. Light flooded in. Gregory loomed over her, bleeding from the shoulder, beautiful features twisted into pure cornered hatred. "If I cannot have the throne," he snarled, "he cannot have you." He drove a silver stiletto straight toward her heart. But South Boston had not raised a helpless girl. Terror had lived with Abigail so long it had sharpened into instinct. Her hand closed around the broken stem of a crystal glass lying in spilled blood on the floor. She rolled hard to one side and drove the jagged shard upward into the soft flesh of Gregory's inner thigh. He screamed. The stiletto struck wood where her chest had been a fraction before. "You little human bitch," he roared, ripping the shard free. He raised one hand to kill her. Then a shadow fell over both of them and the air froze solid. Dominic stood behind Gregory, eyes blazing infernal red. The energy around him felt ancient enough to crack stone. "She is not a pet," he said, and his voice carried through the hall until even battle seemed to pause for it. "And she is not yours to touch." Then Dominic's hand punched through Gregory's back, straight through cloth, flesh, bone, and heart. Gregory's mouth opened in a wet gasp. Dominic ripped his hand back out. Gregory collapsed into ash before he even hit the floor. Silence struck the hall so hard it felt like a blow. The remaining traitors dropped their weapons and fell to their knees among blood and dust. The rebellion was over. Abigail stayed on the floor, chest heaving, one hand cut and bleeding, gown ruined, staring at the place where Gregory had been. The monster had won. But that was not the right thought anymore. Because Dominic did not turn first to the kneeling survivors or to the court waiting in frozen fear for judgment. He turned to her. Then, in full view of everyone in that ruined hall, the king of the Eastern Night dropped to one knee amid the wreckage and reached beneath the broken table for Abigail Hayes. The aftermath of immortal violence had no mercy in it. No medics, no shouted orders to save the wounded, no groaning men clinging to life. Only ash drifting down over expensive rugs, blood drying on silver, and a silence so deep Abigail could hear her own shaking breaths inside it. She was still under the wrecked table when Dominic's hand found her wrist. Cold, strong, steady. "You are bleeding, little bird," he said aloud, his voice roughened by battle and poison and something she did not yet know how to name. She looked at the blood on her own hand as if it belonged to someone else. Gregory's blood, her blood, the blood of a court built on fear. "I've survived worse," she whispered. Her voice still felt unreal, but it no longer felt impossible. Dominic's gaze dropped to her cut palm, and for one dark second the scent of her blood shifted something in his face. Hunger flashed there, primitive, sharp. Then it was gone under iron control. He crouched lower, slid one arm behind her back, and lifted her out from under the table as if the wreckage around them did not exist. Once she was standing, he did not let go of her hand. He laced his freezing fingers through hers and turned to face the grand hall with Abigail beside him. That simple choice changed everything. He did not place her behind him. He did not push her toward the servants. He kept her at his side where all could see. The vampires remaining in the hall stood in stunned formation around broken chairs, shattered crystal, and the ash of their dead. Lady Vivian's painted face had gone pale even by immortal standards. Alistair Reed knelt with his head bowed, relieved and wary at once. The traitors who still lived were already being dragged away. No one moved without permission. No one spoke. Then Lady Vivian made the mistake of thinking the old rules still applied. She stepped forward with careful grace, though the fan in her hand trembled. "My king," she purred, "praise be to the night that you stand victorious. But surely the mortal pet should be removed. The trauma has clearly driven her to some sort of—" Abigail squeezed Dominic's hand before she even realized she had done it. He looked down at her. She looked back. Something passed between them, silent and immediate. She did not want him to speak for her. Not this time. Not after 10 years of choosing silence to survive. Dominic's eyes narrowed very slightly. Then he released just enough of his hold to let her step ahead. The hall watched as the human girl everyone had mocked moved in front of the vampire king. Abigail drew in a breath that hurt all the way down. "I'm not a pet," she said. The words rang across the hall, clear, steady. Every face changed, some with shock, some with outrage, some with a fear more interesting than either. Abigail kept going. "I have heard every cruel whisper you made because it suited me to hear and remain silent. I have been mute because in the human world silence kept me alive. But my mind is perfectly intact, Lady Vivian. I heard Gregory plan treason in the library. I heard your whispers tonight. I heard who among you was ready to kneel to the next monster the moment this one seemed weak." The room inhaled as one. Lady Vivian physically recoiled. She looked to Dominic as if expecting punishment to fall on Abigail for daring to speak so plainly before ancient blood. Instead, Dominic smiled. It was slow, dark, and almost dangerously pleased. He stepped up behind Abigail, one arm sliding around her waist with possessive protection that also felt somehow like permission. When he spoke, the whole hall bowed under the force of it. "Hear me well. Gregory's treason is ended. The Sterling Court stands." His crimson gaze swept the room. "From this night forward, Abigail Hayes is no longer a guest in this house. She is under my absolute protection." A murmur started, then died when his eyes flashed. "For centuries," Dominic continued, "you have mistaken humans for currency, livestock, diversion. Tonight a human saw what immortals missed. A human chose truth over safety. A human bled for this crown." He pulled Abigail closer, not hiding what she meant. "Any insult against her is an insult against me. Any whisper in shadow will be answered in blood. Is that understood?" The reply rolled back in frightened unison. "Yes, my king." Dominic leaned down, his lips near Abigail's ear, hidden by the angle of his head. "You asked what you are to me," he murmured so only she could hear. "You are the one who hears truth when the world lies. You are not beneath me, Abigail. You stand beside me." The words hit harder than all the violence of the night, because they gave her something she had never truly had. Not safety, not yet, something more dangerous. Place. An hour later, the grand hall had been cleaned with terrifying efficiency. The dead were ash. The traitors were chained beneath the manor. The chandeliers glittered as if no massacre had happened at all, but blood memory still clung to the stones. Dominic brought Abigail back to his study and locked the doors behind them. This time the silence in the room felt different, Not like the silence of fear, not like the silence of deception. Chosen silence, earned silence. Beatrice came and went, washing the cuts on Abigail's hand, smoothing salve across her scraped skin, helping her into soft clothes that did not pinch or weigh her down. Abigail barely spoke while the older woman worked, not from fear now but from the strange newness of possibility. When they were alone again, Dominic stood by the hearth in rolled shirt sleeves. No jacket, no court face, only the hard, beautiful lines of a predator who had nearly died and killed a traitor kingmaker for trying. Poured amber liquid into 2 glasses and handed one to Abigail. "Drink," he said. "It will ease your throat." She took a cautious sip and coughed once at the burn, smoke, peat, caramel, heat spread slowly down her chest. Dominic sat opposite her in the leather chair and watched the fire for a while, not hunting a reaction now, waiting, letting her choose. It was a strange kindness. She looked into the blue-orange heart of the flames and finally asked the question that had been living under her skin for weeks. "When you told me my blood smelled like wild flowers and old magic, were you trying to frighten me into reacting?" Dominic did not even blink. "No, I told you the truth." The room seemed to sharpen around that answer. He set his glass down and leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "There are bloodlines in the human world that most immortals believe extinct. Bloodlines my kind hunted nearly to death centuries ago because they threaten what we are." Abigail frowned. "My mother worked at a bakery. She liked roses and mint tea and overwatering her plants. There was nothing mythical about her." Dominic's expression turned grim. "The day after I brought you here, I had Richard Hayes and your mother investigated. I wanted to know what I had bought." The words should have offended her. Somehow they no longer did, not because they were kind, because they were honest. The crossfire outside O'Connor's pub was not random, Abigail. The men involved were tied to the O'Driscoll syndicate, and the O'Driscolls were a human front for the Northern Coven. Abigail's fingers tightened around the glass. "What are you saying?" Dominic held her gaze. "Your mother was the target." The room tilted. She stared at him, unable to breathe for one long, horrible second. "No," she whispered. "They were fighting over money, that's what everyone said." "Everyone lied," Dominic said. "Your mother, Nora Hayes, was descended from a line known in old records as Nulls, humans whose blood disrupts immortal compulsion and resists telepathy. To us, they are rare and dangerous because we cannot easily bend them, cannot easily enter them, cannot easily own them." He let that settle before adding the final blow. "You carry that blood more strongly than she did." Abigail stood so fast the scotch nearly spilled. She walked 2 unsteady steps toward the fire and pressed a hand to her mouth. 10 years of grief rearranged itself in an instant. Her mother had not died in random street violence. She had been hunted. Her silence had not only been trauma, it had been instinct, shield, blood memory. "Did my father know?" The question came out half-strangled. Dominic rose but did not crowd her. He suspected enough to be afraid. "After your mother died, he drank to forget that monsters were real. Then he sold you to one because he thought handing you over might spare his own skin." Something in Abigail hardened then, not with fresh pain but with final understanding. Richard Hayes had not been weak. He had been willing. The small part of her that still hoped for some buried excuse turned to ash as cleanly as Gregory had. Tears filled her eyes anyway, not for her father. For the mother who had died keeping secrets she never got to explain. For the little girl who had built a life inside false deafness because nobody came to save her. Dominic crossed the room at last and knelt in front of her. A king kneeling again. The same impossible image, now private. He took the glass gently from her hand and set it aside. Then he held her face between both cold palms as if she were something breakable and dangerous at once. "Her history does not have to dictate your future," he said, and every word landed with deliberate force. "You survived the human world by hiding, but in my world hiding will not protect you forever. Truth will, position will, power will." Abigail laughed once through tears, the sound raw and disbelieving. "Power? I don't even know who I am." Dominic's thumbs brushed the tears from under her eyes. "You are the first person in centuries to stand in my court without bending because my kind frightens you into obedience. You deceived me under my own roof. You outplayed vampires using a human skill they overlooked. You heard treason, weighed danger, and chose action. Do not mistake a frightened childhood for weakness, Abigail. You have been dangerous all along. She stared down at him. His face in the firelight looked carved from shadow and devotion and ancient hunger. This was the man who had bought her like property, tested her like prey, then trusted her in a room full of killers. The contradiction should have terrified her more than it did. "And what," she asked softly, "do you want from me now?" Dominic did not answer at once. His eyes flicked to her mouth, then back to her eyes. "Honesty," he said, "even when it cuts, especially then." He rose slowly, never taking his gaze from hers. "I could place you in a guarded wing, keep you hidden, let the court think you are a protected curiosity. It would be safer for a while." He stepped closer. "But that is another kind of cage, and I think you have lived inside enough of those." Abigail felt her heartbeat shift under her ribs. "And if I don't want a cage," Dominic's mouth curved very slightly, "then do not take one." He touched the sapphire choker still resting at her throat, his knuckles brushing the bruised skin beneath. "Stay. Learn this house. Learn these people. Learn what you are. Learn how to cut through a room full of lies the way you did tonight." His voice dropped lower now, intimate and ruthless and almost reverent. "Rule beside me, Abigail, not because I rescued you, not because I bought your debt, because every court needs one person no vampire can compel, no vampire can silence, and no coward can fool." Her breath caught. Queen. He had not said the word. He did not need to. It hung in the room between them anyway, dangerous and impossible. Morning did not break over the Sterling estate so much as arrive reluctantly in thin silver light. Abigail had not slept. She stood by the tall study windows in borrowed soft clothes, looking over frozen grounds while her thoughts moved in storms. South Boston felt 1,000 years away. The apartment, the bottles, the moldy wallpaper. Richard passed out in the chair. That life had ended the moment Dominic stepped through the door, but only now did she understand how fully. She was not going back. Not to the silence, not to the lie, not to the father who sold her. Dominic entered behind her without sound. "The court will expect a statement by tonight," he said. Abigail turned. "About Gregory, about you," Dominic corrected. "They can survive a traitor. What unsettles them is a human who spoke and was not crushed for it." There was no mockery in his tone, only fact. Abigail folded her arms over herself, then forced them down. No more shrinking. "Then let them be unsettled." Dominic's eyes warmed with that same dark amusement she had seen in the hall. "That," he said, "is exactly the correct answer." He came to stand in front of her. For a long moment neither moved. Then Abigail asked the last question that still mattered. "When you came to that apartment, why me? You could have taken anything from my father. Why did you choose me?" Dominic's expression shifted, and for once she saw something like the ghost of vulnerability beneath the king. "Because when I looked at you," he said quietly, "I saw a girl standing in ruin with a pulse too disciplined for her age and a mind I could not enter. I did not know what you were. I only knew that for the first time in a very long time I was curious. And in my world, curiosity is dangerous." Abigail searched his face. "For whom?" He stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "For both of us." She should have looked away. She did not. The old Abigail would have. The one who survived by pretending not to notice danger, but danger had changed shape. It now stood before her in a dark shirt with storm-gray eyes and blood on its soul, and offered her a throne instead of a cage. "I'm not yours," she said, the words coming out steady. "Not a rejection, a boundary, a truth." Dominic nodded once. "No," he said, "you are not." Then after a beat, with a look that made her blood turn hot despite the cold of him, he added, "That is precisely why I will never underestimate you." Something fierce and startled unfurled inside her. Not surrender, not safety, something stronger, choice. She lifted her chin. "Good, because I'm done being underestimated." Dominic's answering smile was small and devastating. "So is everyone else." By nightfall the court gathered again, not for a banquet this time, but for judgment. Abigail walked into the chamber beside Dominic, wearing dark velvet and the sapphire at her throat, no longer at his feet, no longer on a cushion, no longer pretending not to hear the whispers snapping dead as she passed. Every eye followed her. Every old rule strained. Dominic took his place and did not sit until Abigail stood at his right hand. Then he addressed the court. naming Gregory's treason, the punishment of every co-conspirator, and the loyalty of those who stood true. But the room still waited on the human girl who had broken 10 years of silence. Abigail felt the weight of immortal expectation press down and chose, deliberately, not to bow to it. She stepped forward. "You all thought silence meant weakness," she said. "You thought because I did not answer, I did not understand. Because I looked broken, I could not see you clearly. That was your mistake." She let the words travel through the chamber, through their cold, elegant faces, through centuries of arrogance. "Silence kept me alive in the human world, but it also let me hear everything people hide when they think you don't matter, and I heard enough in this house to know one truth." She looked around the chamber slowly. "Monsters are not defined by fangs. They are defined by what they do with power." No one moved. No one dared. Dominic's gaze on her back felt like approval and warning both. Abigail finished with the one truth that had remade her entire life. "I was sold by a man who called himself my father. I was hunted by those who feared what my blood meant. I was underestimated by this court. Never again." The silence after that belonged to her. Dominic rose beside her, his presence filling the chamber like storm tide, but for once he did not need to rescue the moment. Abigail had already taken it. He looked at the court, then at her, and the final power shift settled into place so cleanly it felt inevitable. "You wish to know where she stands," Dominic said. "Now you do." He turned slightly toward Abigail, not above her but with her, and every vampire in that chamber saw it. Saw the king choosing not a toy, not a thrall, not a fragile human kept for novelty, but a woman who had stepped out of 10 years of silence and spoken like judgment itself. That night, alone in the corridor outside the chamber, Dominic reached for her hand. Abigail let him take it. His grip was cold. Hers was not. "You changed the balance of my world," he said. Abigail looked at him, at the beautiful, immortal ruler who had entered her life like a nightmare and become something far more complicated. "No," she said quietly. "I just stopped pretending I was powerless." Dominic bowed his head the smallest fraction, as if acknowledging a truth bigger than either of them. "Then may every fool who mistook your silence for surrender remember what it cost them." Abigail Hayes once believed silence was the only thing that could save her. A dead mother, a drunken father, a city that crushed weak girls and forgot their names. She hid inside fake deafness because the world taught her that the unseen survive longer. But survival was never the end of her story. In the House of Monsters, silence became a weapon. Truth became a blade. And the voice she buried for 10 years did not return to beg for mercy. It returned to expose traitors, challenge power, and change the throne itself. Dominic Sterling bought a broken girl to settle a debt. What he got was the one person in his kingdom he could never control, never compel, and never afford to lose. And now the question is not whether Abigail will survive the vampire court. The real question is this: if the only way to destroy a cruel world is to stand beside a monster who loves you, does that make you brave, or does it make you dangerous too? If you felt that shift, comment your answer below. Was Abigail right to trust the Vampire King, or should she have run from him while she still could? Like this video if you want more dark vampire stories with fierce heroines and brutal twists. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story will go even deeper into the night. Why Betrayal? Why Cassie H story?